Snow-covered expanses, icy winds that chilled you to the bone, and frozen rivers. This was what winter looked like in England during the Middle Ages. Without the central heating and warm houses we are accustomed to today, survival during the cold season was a particularly pressing issue. Clothing played a key role not only in protecting against the cold, but also in maintaining health and productivity. It was not just an element of the wardrobe, but a complex and multifunctional system. Every layer, every detail had its own purpose. But how did people of that time cope with the cold using only wool, linen, and fur? In this video, we will immerse ourselves in the world of medieval fashion and learn how properly chosen clothing could save lives.
That should keep you warm on your journey.
Watch the video to the end, and you will learn how one small but very important detail in medieval clothing could save you from frostbite. Did you know that in the Middle Ages, there was clothing that could be worn inside out? Some cloaks and tunics were made reversible. One side could be made of thick, dark wool for cold and damp days, and the other of a thinner, lighter fabric for warmer weather. It was a practical solution that allowed you to have two items in one. Dark wool absorbs sunlight better, providing extra warmth on rare sunny winter days. At the same time, the light side, made of linen, helped keep you cool in warm weather. This solution was not only convenient, but also economical, as it allowed you to have two items without buying two. Double-sided clothing was a real engineering solution for its time. Its versatility made it indispensable in conditions where people had a limited number of items. In addition to its practical use, such clothing also had aesthetic value. The everyday dark side could be simple and unobtrusive, while the festive, light side could be decorated with embroidery or other decorative elements. This allowed people to change their look without buying new clothes. The production of reversible clothing was complex and required high skill from weavers and tailors. They had to join two different fabrics in such a way that they were durable and comfortable to wear. Particular attention was paid to the seams, which had to be invisible from both sides. Special stitches were used to join the fabrics, allowing the clothes to remain flexible and not restrict movement. Such clothing was especially popular among travelers and merchants. They did not need to take many things with them, as reversible clothing allowed them to have two different looks in one item. This was very convenient when they had to move around a lot. At the same time, such clothing was very warm, which was very important for people who spent a lot of time outdoors. Reversible clothing was not only practical, but also symbolic. It was an indicator of status and wealth, as only people who had access to expensive materials and skilled craftsmanship could afford it. It was a symbol that a person could afford the luxury of having two things in one. At the same time, it was a symbol of practicality and rationality, as it allowed people to use their resources more efficiently. This garment was not only warm, but also very comfortable. It did not restrict movement and allowed people to move freely. This was very important for people who worked a lot outdoors. They could easily change clothes without spending much time on it. Reversible clothing was one of many examples of how people at that time used the resources available to them to solve complex problems. It was not just sewing, but a well-thought-out engineering solution that allowed people to survive in the harshest conditions. How else, besides saving money, do you think reversible clothing could have been used? Write about it in the comments, and we'll discuss the most interesting options. During the cold season, men wore special loincloths called breeches or breeches. They were made of thick wool and worn under tunics. They were very important for keeping warm, as they protected against the cold and damp. On particularly cold days, they could be worn in several layers. Limb guards were not only practical, but also part of fashion. They were decorated with embroidery and precious stones, especially among the nobility. The wearing of loincloths was widespread, from peasants to kings. For ordinary people, they could be simple loincloths made of coarse wool, while for the nobility, they were richly decorated fabrics that symbolized their wealth. Lederhosen were, in essence, the first pants worn in Europe. They were very important for keeping warm, as they protected against the cold and damp. In the Middle Ages, there were no trousers as we know them today, and loincloths were the only way to protect the legs. They were made of thick wool, which made them very warm. Wool, as we have already mentioned, was excellent at retaining heat, even when wet. This was very important in the damp and cold winters. The production of loincloths was complicated and required high skill from tailors. They had to join several pieces of fabric in such a way that the loincloths were comfortable to wear and did not restrict movement. Special attention was paid to the seams, which had to be strong and invisible. Special stitches were used to join the fabrics, allowing the clothing to remain flexible. Lendings were not only practical but also fashionable. Rich people wore loincloths decorated with embroidery, precious stones, and metal. These decorations were a symbol of their wealth and status. Loincloths were not only functional, but also decorative. They were made from different materials such as fine wool, linen, or even silk. In addition, loincloths were very important for maintaining hygiene. They could be easily removed and washed, which was very important in conditions where people did not have many clothes. This helped prevent infections and other health problems. Lendings were one of many examples of how people at that time used the resources available to them to solve complex problems. It was not just sewing, but a well-thought-out engineering solution that allowed people to survive in the harshest conditions. They were not only warm, but also very comfortable. They did not restrict movement and allowed people to move freely. This was very important for people who worked a lot outdoors. They could easily change clothes without spending a lot of time doing so. Lederhosen were a real lifesaver for those who worked in the fields or on construction sites. They protected the legs from the cold and damp, which was very important for their health. They were not only warm, but also very comfortable, which made them indispensable. Thus, loincloths were not just an item of clothing, but a key survival tool that combined practicality, versatility, and symbolism. They were indispensable in harsh winters and allowed people to stay warm and safe. Have you ever wondered what was the most vulnerable part of a medieval person's clothing in the bitter cold? Watch the video to the end to find out the answer to this question. Woolen garters, worn under stockings, were not just a decorative element. They helped keep the stockings in place and created an extra layer of air that helped retain heat. They were made of thick wool and often had embroidery, especially among the nobility. Garters were very important in winter as they helped keep warm and prevented stockings from slipping down. They were simple but effective and were part of everyday life. Garters, or garters as they were called in the Middle Ages, were an indispensable part of both men's and women's wardrobes. Men used them to hold up hose, thick woolen stockings worn under tunics. Without garters, hose could slip down, which would not only be uncomfortable but also lead to heat loss. Women used them to hold up stockings or shawls worn on their legs. Garters were made from various materials such as wool, silk, or linen. Among the nobility, they could be decorated with embroidery, precious stones, or even gold thread. The production of garters was a very important craft. They had to be strong enough to hold stockings in place, but at the same time elastic enough not to restrict movement. Special stitches were used to make them, which allowed the garters to stretch. Garters were not only practical, but also part of fashion. They were a symbol of status and wealth. Rich people wore garters decorated with embroidery, precious stones, and metal. These decorations were a symbol of their wealth and status. Garters were not only functional, but also decorative. They were made from various materials such as fine wool, linen, or even silk. In addition, garters were very important for maintaining hygiene. They could be easily removed and washed, which was very important in conditions where people did not have many clothes. This helped prevent infections and other health problems. Garters were one of many examples of how people at that time used the resources available to them to solve complex problems. It was not just sewing, but a well-thought-out engineering solution that allowed people to survive in the harshest conditions. They were not only warm, but also very comfortable. They did not restrict movement and allowed people to move freely. This was very important for people who worked a lot outdoors. They could easily change clothes without spending a lot of time doing so. Garters were a real lifesaver for those who worked in the fields or on construction sites. They protected the legs from the cold and damp, which was very important for their health. They were not only warm, but also very comfortable, which made them indispensable. Thus, garters were not just an item of clothing, but a key survival tool that combined practicality, versatility, and symbolism. They were indispensable in harsh winters and allowed people to stay warm and safe. Did you know that headwear in the Middle Ages was multifunctional? For example, a chaperone could not only be worn on the head, but also used as a scarf or even a shoulder wrap. This was very convenient, as it allowed one item to be used for different purposes. The chaperone was made of thick wool and had long, hanging ends. These ends could be wrapped around the neck to create an extra layer of warmth. On particularly cold days, they could be wrapped around the face to protect it from wind and snow. It evolved from a simple hood, becoming an increasingly complex and elegant item of clothing. But the chaperone was not the only practical headwear of the era. Another, much simpler but no less important item was the coif, a modest linen cap worn by both men and women. It served as a kind of base layer, protecting the hair from dirt and dust and keeping it neat. For people engaged in physical labor, the coif was indispensable, as it prevented hair from getting into food or machinery. Knights wore it under a chainmail hood, coiffe de maille, to prevent it from rubbing against the skin, ensuring comfort and hygiene in the harshest conditions. Although the coif was hidden under more elaborate headgear, its practicality cannot be overestimated. Women's fashion of that era also followed the principles of practicality. The wimple, or headdress covering the neck, was not only a symbol of modesty, but also reliable protection from the cold and wind. It was often worn with a barbette, a ribbon that passed under the chin and was fastened at the top of the head, holding the entire structure in place. These headdresses were especially important for married women, as they hid their hair, which was considered a rule of propriety. But beyond their social role, they were incredibly functional for women working in the fields or in the kitchen, as they protected them from the sun, dirt, and soot. Headwear also served as important indicators of social status, but their primary function always remained practical. Common people wore coarse woolen hoods that were comfortable and durable, protecting them from the elements while working in the fields or in the forest. The nobility, in turn, preferred headwear made from more expensive materials such as silk, velvet, and brocade, often decorated with fur or precious stones. However, even these were not without practical use. For example, the voluminous escarpets worn by noble ladies had a stiff base that not only held their elaborate hairstyles in place, but also provided an extra layer of warmth. Men's turbans and felt hats were also ideal for protection from the scorching sun or pouring rain. Materials played a huge role in the practicality of headwear. Simple wool, which was available to most people, repelled moisture well and retained heat. Linen was ideal for light summer headdresses, as it was breathable and quick to dry. Expensive fabrics such as silk and velvet were the privilege of the wealthy, but even these were chosen with practicality in mind. For example, silk linings made headwear more comfortable to wear, while fur trim added not only luxury, but also warmth. Thus, even the simplest headwear was carefully designed to serve its owner, protecting them from the elements and making everyday life a little more comfortable. This emphasizes that fashion in the Middle Ages was not detached from reality. Every element of the wardrobe, from a simple hood to an elaborate chaperone, was designed with real human needs in mind. A headdress could be a fashion accessory, a status symbol, and protection from the weather all at the same time. Medieval people were masters of multifunctionality, and their headwear is a vivid confirmation of this. They learned to make the most of every item, as resources were limited. Even the simplest details of clothing had a hidden purpose. Do you know what else was multifunctional in the Middle Ages? Lining. Although, perhaps it just hid all the flaws. In any case, we'll talk about that soon.
Keep watching.
In the Middle Ages, lining in clothing was much more than just an inner layer. It was an invisible but vital detail that performed several critical functions, including comfort, hygiene, and even the durability of the garment. In a world where every item was valuable and handmade, lining served practical and economic purposes. The main and perhaps most obvious role of lining was to retain heat. The inner layer, whether made of linen, cotton, or more expensive materials such as fur, created an additional air layer. This layer acted as a natural insulator, preventing heat loss from the body and protecting against the biting wind. For people living in northern regions, where winters were long and harsh, linings made of fur, sheepskin, or thick wool were not a luxury but a necessity. They made outer garments such as cloaks, tunics, and doublets truly suitable for life in the cold. In addition to insulation, lining played a key role in hygiene. In those days, when frequent washing of large and heavy woolen or leather garments was impractical and even harmful to the fabrics themselves, linen or cotton lining solved this problem. These fabrics easily absorbed sweat and skin oils, protecting the main outer fabric from contamination. When the lining became dirty, it was much easier to unpick it, wash it, and sew it back in than to wash the entire garment. This significantly extended the life of expensive outerwear and made it more hygienic to use. The lining also protected the outer fabric from wear and tear. Internal seams, friction against the body, and movement could damage the material over time. This was especially true for materials such as thick wool, cloth, or leather. The lining layer slid against the body, reducing friction and preventing premature wear. In addition, it gave the garment structural integrity and shape, helping it to fit better and retain its appearance. For example, lining could weigh down or conversely lighten clothing, as well as help it keep its shape, which was especially important for sleeves and collars. The choice of lining material also reflected the social status of the owner. While commoners had linings made of coarse linen or wool, the nobility could afford linings made of the finest silk, satin, or even mink, sable, and ermine fur. These expensive materials not only provided additional comfort and warmth, but were also a symbol of wealth and social status. Fur lining peeking out from under the hem of a cloak was a clear sign of high status. It showed that the owner could afford materials that cost more than all the clothes of a commoner. Interestingly, the lining could serve both practical and aesthetic purposes. In the later Middle Ages, when fashion became more complex, the lining was often made of a material that contrasted with the outer fabric in color or texture. When a person moved or took off their cloak, this bright lining became visible, adding an unexpected element of style and luxury. It was a unique way of displaying wealth that was not too ostentatious, but still did not go unnoticed. The lining was also used to hide seams in the internal structure of the garment. In those days, when sewing machines had not yet been invented, all seams were done by hand. The lining covered these seams, making the garment neater and more comfortable to wear, preventing skin irritation from rough threads. This was especially important for multi-layered outfits, where different elements of clothing rubbed against each other. So, lining was not just a piece of fabric sewn into the garment. It was a carefully selected and well-thought-out part of each item. From insulation and hygiene to structural support and status display, its role was multifaceted and indispensable. This proves that there was nothing superfluous in medieval clothing. Every detail had a clear purpose, and often the same solution served several purposes at once. The lining was the invisible foundation that made clothing functional, durable, and ultimately suitable for life. In the Middle Ages, there were special capes that were worn on the hands. They were made of thick wool and often lined with fur. These capes were very convenient, as they could be easily removed when it was warm and put on when it got cold. They were similar to modern muffs, but were longer. They were very popular in winter as they helped keep hands warm. However, this was only one form of hand protection, which, like many other items of clothing at the time, served several important functions at once. The simplest and most common hand coverings were ordinary mittens and gloves worn by peasants, craftsmen, and ordinary townspeople. They were most often made of coarse wool or leather, which made them very durable and protected against the cold. These mittens were simple bags for the hands without separate fingers, which maximized heat retention. For workers such as blacksmiths, bricklayers, or carpenters, thick leather gloves were essential, protecting their hands from cuts, blisters, and burns. They were not so much a fashion accessory as an essential part of their work equipment. In addition to their simple functionality, hand protection could also serve as a status symbol and even have ritual significance. For example, knights' armor for the hands, or gauntlets, were not only part of the armor that protected in battle, they were also a symbol of honor and valor. A challenge to a duel was often accompanied by throwing a gauntlet on the ground. These gloves were a complex construction of a leather base, chainmail, and metal plates. Their inner side often had a soft lining to prevent chafing and make them more comfortable to wear. At the other end of the social spectrum were wealthy townspeople and the nobility. For them, muffs and gloves were not so much a necessity as a way of displaying luxury and elegance. The muffs mentioned earlier were particularly popular among noblewomen. They were made of expensive fabrics such as silk, velvet, or brocade, and lined with precious furs such as ermine, marten, or sable. Wearing a muff was not only a sign of wealth, but also of social status, as a lady wearing a muff was clearly not engaged in physical labor. Leather gloves with separate fingers were also a privilege of the upper classes. They were worn not only for warmth, but also as part of an elegant outfit. Such gloves were often decorated with embroidery, pearls, or precious stones, and were an important element of court etiquette. Removing gloves in the presence of a monarch or a noble person was a sign of respect. There were also special gloves for falconry, which protected the hand from the bird's sharp talons. They were made of thick leather and were one of the attributes of noble entertainment. The materials used for hand coverings were as varied as their purposes. Simple wool and linen were available to everyone. Leather, depending on how it was tanned, could be a coarse material for peasants or a fine, elegant material for the nobility. Fur was perhaps the most indicative material. Rabbit and sheep fur were used to line the mittens of ordinary people, while expensive, exotic furs were available only to the upper classes. The choice of material and the complexity of the workmanship directly indicated the social status and profession of the person wearing the gloves or muff. Thus, hand coverings in the Middle Ages were much more than just items of clothing. They reflected a person's economic position, profession, and social status. From rough but reliable work gloves to elegant but no less functional muffs for ladies, each item had its own unique history and purpose. They combined practicality and social significance, which was characteristic of all medieval fashion. But the most amazing thing is how people used natural materials to make their outfits not only beautiful, but also as functional as possible. I wonder what else people wore in the Middle Ages to keep warm. Maybe fur scarves on their heads? Although, you know, they weren't worn there at all. More on that very soon. Fur scarves in the Middle Ages were much more than just an accessory for warmth. They were a multifaceted symbol reflecting the wealth, status, and even social aspirations of their owner. Made from valuable furs, they were not just a wardrobe item, but rather a mobile statement of a person's position in society. Their functionality was certainly important, but their decorative and symbolic significance was no less significant. Originally, fur products were used primarily for warmth. Thanks to its unique insulating properties, fur was the ideal material for combating the cold. Scarves made of fox, sable, or marten fur provided reliable protection for the neck and shoulders from wind and cold. They were especially popular among the nobility, who could afford such a luxury item. They were worn over heavy cloaks, tunics, and doublets, creating an extra layer of comfort. However, over time, their role began to change. Fur scarves quickly became a visible sign of wealth. Valuable furs such as ermine, sable, and marten were incredibly expensive. Their hunting and processing required great effort and skill. In some regions, their use was even regulated by special luxury laws that determined who was allowed to wear which furs. For example, ermine, known for its snow-white fur with black tips, was reserved exclusively for royalty and the higher clergy. Wearing such a scarf was not just fashionable, it was a statement of belonging to the elite. In addition to their symbolic meaning, fur scarves were also an important element of decorative art. They were often richly decorated. The skins were sewn together with great care to create a smooth and luxurious surface. Sometimes they were complemented with embroidery, pearls, or precious stones, transforming a simple scarf into a true work of art. They were worn not only for warmth, but also to add elegance and sophistication to an outfit. The fur was soft, pleasant to the touch, and draped beautifully, making it ideal for creating elegant silhouettes. In some cases, fur scarves were not only worn on the shoulders. They could be used as decorative trim for collars, sleeves, or the hem of cloaks. This allowed clothing to be given a special chic and demonstrated the status of the owner, even in small details. Unlike modern scarves, which can be tied in different ways, medieval fur scarves were often single pieces of fur that were simply thrown over the shoulder or attached to clothing. This created a striking and memorable image that made a noble person stand out from the crowd. Fur scarves also played a role in court life and etiquette. They could be part of formal attire or serve as gifts symbolizing respect and friendship. Receiving a fur scarf made from expensive fur was a sign of special favor, further emphasizing their value. They could be worn by both men and women, although the style and manner of wearing them could differ. Men preferred more austere and concise scarves, while women's scarves could be more lavish and decorated. Thus, the fur scarf was not just an item of clothing. It was the embodiment of status, wealth, elegance, and power. It was a symbol that conveyed much more information about its owner than words could ever express. From a simple means of protection against the cold, it evolved into a luxury item that only a select few could afford. Its functionality was inextricably linked to its decorative and social significance, making it one of the most interesting accessories of the Middle Ages. Fur was a symbol that remained relevant for centuries, and its value only grew over time. In addition to scarves, there were other unusual ways to use fur in the Middle Ages. For example, it was used to make special decorations for clothing that could be attached to tunics or cloaks. These served not only as decoration, but also to keep the wearer warm. Thus, fur was used in the most unexpected ways, adding luxury and comfort to everyday life. Leather boots with fur lining in the Middle Ages were both a luxury item and a necessity. Their value was determined not only by their ability to protect against the harsh winter cold, but also by the materials from which they were made. At a time when survival depended directly on the ability to adapt to weather conditions, such footwear was an important asset available only to the select few. It demonstrated the status of its owner and provided comfort that was unavailable to the majority of the population. The main function of such boots was to keep the feet warm and protect them from frostbite. Leather was the ideal material for the outer part of the footwear, as it is strong, durable, and able to repel moisture. It protected the feet from dirt, snow, and sharp objects on the road. A thick sole, often made of several layers of leather, provided additional insulation from the cold ground. The inner fur lining served as an excellent heat insulator. It created an air layer that trapped the heat generated by the body and prevented the cold from penetrating inside. Fur was commonly used for this purpose, as it was not only warm, but also durable, such as sheepskin or fox fur. Having such a lining in boots was critical for those who spend a lot of time outdoors in winter, whether they were travelers, warriors, or hunters. Despite their practicality, leather boots with fur lining were a clear symbol of status and wealth. Their prices were exorbitantly high. This was due not only to the cost of materials, but also to the labor-intensive process of their manufacture. High-quality leather required lengthy processing, and valuable fur, such as sable, ermine, or marten, could cost a fortune. Therefore, such footwear was only available to members of the nobility, wealthy merchants, and high-ranking officials. They wore these boots not only for protection from the cold, but also to demonstrate their position in society. While ordinary people had to make do with rough leather boots or even wooden clogs, the nobility could afford footwear that was not only functional, but also aesthetically appealing. Over time, the design of fur-lined leather boots changed, reflecting fashion trends and technical innovations. In the early Middle Ages, they were simpler and more utilitarian, but with the development of crafts and the growth of the nobility's wealth, more sophisticated models began to appear. Boots could have elegant shapes and be decorated with embossed leather, decorative laces, or buckles. Fur could be visible, protruding from the edges of the boot to emphasize its value. Depending on the region and fashion, boots could be tall, covering the calf, or shorter. In some cases, they even had decorative elements that had no practical significance, but added luxury and exclusivity to the footwear. Overall, leather boots with fur lining were an item that perfectly combined practicality and luxury. They were indispensable for survival in harsh winters, protecting the wearer from the cold and frostbite. At the same time, they served as a powerful symbol of wealth, separating the elite from the common people. Their existence highlights how, in the Middle Ages, even the most utilitarian items could have deep social and cultural significance. They were a testament to the skill of craftsmen who could transform raw materials into something that was both functional and beautiful. In the Middle Ages, when central heating was just a fantasy and castles and stone houses were freezing cold, people looked for any way to stay warm. One of the simplest but most ingenious solutions was seat pads. These simple items were an integral part of everyday life, providing at least some comfort in harsh conditions. They were more than just a soft surface. They were practical tools for survival in a world where cold was a constant companion. The primary purpose of mats was obvious. They created an insulating barrier between the human body and the cold surface. Whether it was a stone bench in a large castle hall, a wooden chair in a tavern, or even the ground. They were most often made of thick, heavy wool, which was an excellent insulator in itself. Wool not only retained heat, but was also durable enough to withstand daily use. For the upper classes, bedding could be lined with fur. Fur, as we already know, was the best material for retaining heat, and its softness made sitting much more comfortable. A wide variety of furs were used, from ordinary sheepskin, which was available to many, to expensive ones such as fox or even marten fur, which were the privilege of the nobility. Despite their practicality, bedding was not uniform. Its shape, size, and finish depended on the social status of the owner. For commoners, they could be simple, made of rolled woolen fabric or a piece of sheepskin. In wealthy homes and castles, seat cushions could be part of the interior, decorated with embroidery, fringe, or even coats of arms. They could be of different sizes, small for individual use, or long, designed for sitting on benches in the dining room. They could be moved from room to room, making them a versatile and practical household item. While furniture was usually bulky and immovable, a seat pad was a personal item that was always close at hand. Seat pads were one of the few items that brought physical comfort to the lives of people at that time. Not only did they protect against the cold, but they also made hard and uncomfortable seats more tolerable. This was especially important during long dinners, meetings, or religious services. They helped prevent freezing and simply made life a little more pleasant. For those who could afford more luxurious options with fur trim, a seat pad was a symbol of their privileged status. It showed that the owner could afford not only functionality, but also luxury in the simplest of things. The use of seat cushions was so widespread that they became part of everyday rituals. People could have several of these mats, one for home, another for church, and a third for traveling. This shows that they valued their comfort, and mats were just as important to them as, say, warm clothes or good shoes. In a world where harsh conditions were the norm, these simple items served as a reminder of the possibility of a little comfort. They were simple but effective, and their widespread use shows that people have always sought to make their lives a little better and warmer. In the Middle Ages, the concept of sleepwear was completely different from what it is today. For most people, there was no separate wardrobe for nighttime. They often slept in the same clothes they wore during the day. This was due to both economic reasons and the lack of hygiene standards we are accustomed to today. In peasant and working class families where every item was precious, it was unthinkable to spend fabric on a separate nightshirt. People simply loosened their belts, unbuttoned their outer garments, and went to bed in tunics or rags. However, with increasing prosperity, especially among the nobility, specialized sleepwear began to appear. These were nightshirts that served as a symbol of luxury and comfort, available only to a few. Unlike the heavy woolen or leather garments worn during the day, these nightshirts were made of thin linen. Linen was the ideal material for this purpose, as it was light, breathable, and very pleasant to the body. It did not cause overheating and allowed the skin to breathe, which was especially important in cramped and poorly ventilated rooms. The design of nightshirts was simple and functional. They were long, loose tunics that did not restrict movement during sleep. The absence of tight belts, ties, and stiff collars ensured maximum comfort. For women, nightgowns often resembled their daytime dresses, but were simpler and without elaborate trim. For men, they were long shirts similar to their everyday tunics, but without linings or decorative elements. The simplicity of the cut and material made them not only comfortable, but also easy to care for, which was an important consideration at the time. These nightshirts also had hygienic significance. At a time when frequent washing of everyday clothes was a difficult and time-consuming task, a linen nightshirt could be washed more often. This helped to keep the body clean and protect expensive outer garments from dirt. Thus, the nightshirt served two functions. It provided comfort and promoted personal hygiene. Although this practice was only available to the wealthy, it was the first step toward creating a separate wardrobe for nighttime. Overall, nightshirts were an early indication of how, even in the Middle Ages, people sought comfort and personal hygiene using the means available to them. Despite their simplicity, they were an important step in the development of clothing and demonstrated how everyday habits change with increasing prosperity. We have learned how seemingly simple medieval clothing became a complex system that helped people survive in harsh winter conditions. It was not just sewing, but a well-thought-out engineering solution. Every detail, from the layering to the use of fur and leather, played a role in creating a comfortable environment. We saw how people of that time used the resources available to them to solve complex problems. It was a true symbiosis of fashion and everyday ingenuity that allowed people to survive in the harshest conditions. Tell us in the comments what other tricks related to medieval clothing you would like to learn about. For example, how did they protect food from rodents? Or how did they create lighting? Don't forget to subscribe to the channel so you don't miss our new videos. See you soon.
Subscribe to our channel for more tales and adventures.